Out of the Easy is set in New Orleans in 1950, and it follows the story of 17-year-old Josie Moraine, who's the daughter of a brothel prostitute. But despite the life that she's born into, she aspires to something more. She wants to go to college, and specifically she wants to go to Smith, which is outside of New Orleans. So, it's a story of family, it's a story of identity, and overcoming one's circumstances.
Out of the Easy isn't as earth-shattering as Between Shades of Grey, in that it doesn't deal with as maybe complicated or important in a historical sense. Were you conscious of that, and did that impact your search for a new story?
No, I wasn't conscious of it, because although they're both historical, to me they're both intensely emotional. In Between Shades of Grey, Lena is she's on a quest for freedom, but so is Josie. And so these are things that are intensely personal as these young girls are growing up and dealing with who and what they want to be and who they can become. And so, no, for me, both were these sort of personal, and certainly the history was different. Totalitarianism, dealing with totalitarianism in Between Shades of Grey. But no, I didn't really consciously think of that. I chose to focus, as I was writing, more on the emotional truth of both of the stories rather than the historical truth.
You've already said that both Lena and Josie share a sense of freedom, but you've also chosen to have two female main characters in both your books. What made you do that, and was it hard to kind of distance yourself from Lena's narrative before writing Out of the Easy?
Well, people ask if Josie and Lena they're a part of you. No, I wish. I mean, these girls are superheroes, and so I know some writers, they do tend to write main characters that are closely related to their own personal traits. I don't. I think I write characters that I wish I could become, characters I admire with qualities I wish I had, and there are definitely similarities. They're both stubborn, intelligent young women, but then coming from completely different backgrounds. Lena in Between Shades of Grey has a really supportive mother, a loving mother. Lena's relationship to love and the idea of love is something very comfortable and something that comes very natural for her. Josie, on the other hand, is having a hard time not only learning to love, but learning to be loved, considering the family that she's born into. So because, as I say, for me, it's about the emotional truth of the novel. Okay. So although Lena and Josie are both strong, intelligent young women, they're coming from very different backgrounds. Lena has a very comfortable home life. She knows what it feels like to love and to be loved, whereas on the other hand, Josie has no concept of love, and in many cases feels probably that she's unlovable. And so I thought about that a lot as I was creating the character of Josie. What would it be like, to learn to love and learn to be loved? And considering the environment that she's growing up in, on the fringes of a brothel, she would most likely, I imagine, have trust issues, something that that Lena probably wouldn't have. So emotionally, they were coming from very unique perspectives. So that was easy for me to separate the two characters. I didn't get muddled with that.
You've interviewed all these people. Did you base any their character traits on these people, like when you were talking to them, their dialogue or how they speak?
Well, the character of Willie Woodley, the madam in Out of the Easy, she was based on Norma Wallace, and Norma was a notorious French Quarter madam in the 40s and 50s, and I was so fortunate to be able to hear Norma's voice. Late in life, Norma thought, I need to capture my story. So she sat down with a tape recorder and probably a bottle of booze and started recording her life story. Well, a man in New Orleans had these cassette tapes, and he played some of them for me. So I actually got to hear her voice and hear how she described her business, how she ran her business. And, you know, the gruffness in her voice, the toughness, but at certain points when she would speak about something, there was this softness and this fondness that came out. And that really helped inform my character of Willie Woodley. So for that character, it was very much based on Norma. But the other characters were completely fictional, and something that I just, you know, came up with out of my imagination.
So it's set in New Orleans. When did you first get interested in writing about or setting a story in New Orleans?
Well, I've always been interested in New Orleans because there's such diversity, and for a city in America, it's a really unique American city. The music, the architecture, the food, the superstitions make it so different than any other city in the United States. So I had always been fascinated with it. And then for my birthday one year, someone gave me this pair of opera glasses, and they were still in the original vintage case. And when I opened up the case, it still had the jeweler's name in New Orleans and all the original paperwork. And they were engraved and dated from someone named Willie Robert. And I thought, well, wow, I've got the full name. I can probably find out from the census or, you know, who this person was. And so I enlisted the help of a librarian in New Orleans to help me trace the origin of these glasses. And she was interested in the hunt too. So she, you know, did some research and got back to me and said, Willie is not a man, Willie is a woman. And I think she may have been a madam in the French Quarter. Well, there was no may have. Like for me, this was, oh no, I have a madam's opera glasses. I have a hooker's opera glasses. You know, this is a brothel. I love it. And so I became really intrigued. And then she said, well, no, wait, there's more. The jeweler that sold Willie the glasses, he was poisoned. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's brothels and madams and gangsters and people poisoned, you know. And as I was reading news stories from the time period, every newspaper had over a dozen articles that could each be novels in themselves. And so it's just it's a fascinating and complex city and the perfect place to set a novel. And that's why I chose New Orleans.
With Out of Easy, unlike Between Shades of Grey, you've got a certain amount of objectivity because obviously in Between Shades of Grey, your heritage links you directly to Lena's story. How did that affect your writing?
How did it affect writing Out of the Easy?
Yeah, the objectivity of it. How, unlike in Between, yeah.
Well, because I wasn't as colored by personal emotions and personal grief. This was something that was completely fictional, where when I was writing Between Shades of Grey, I knew this had happened, and I knew that some of the things I was writing about had actually happened to my own family members. And in Between Shades of Grey, writing a story, knowing that my freedom and all the liberties that I enjoy came at the expense of my family members, that was such a heavy burden to bear as I was writing, and I so wanted to honor the people that experienced this. Where when I was writing Out of the Easy, I came at it more than historical, more from an emotional. It was an emotional story that I wanted to tell, an emotional story of emotional coming of age, emotional healing. So I was able to remain more objective also because there weren't certain threads that I had to stick to. In Between Shades of Grey, I had interviewed these survivors, and there were certain things that we agreed that I would put in the book, so I had to put them in the book. But in this case of Out of the Easy, I didn't have to put anything. I didn't have to put anything in the book, so I could pick and choose what I thought was really the best from the people that I interviewed, or even just, you know, from my imagination. And so for me, that was a lot more fun.
Just going back to having to put stuff in the book, was that part of a contract you'd had with these Lithuanians that you'd include certain historical accuracies that they wanted portrayed?
No, not so much. They were very, you know, hesitant when I was interviewing them to ask me to put anything in the book. However, if half a dozen people told me the same thing, and the way they told me, holding my hands and saying, this is what happened. And, you know, the world has forgotten us. I could tell it was something so important. So, you know, I wanted to put it in the book. The way they suffered in the train car, the way they missed their relatives, the way they reminisced about holidays and things like that. I knew it was important to them personally, so I put it in the book. So maybe it was just an unspoken contract, you know, if you will. Whereas here, you know, I didn't have any unspoken contracts with hookers or gangsters, so it was a lot easier.
Is there anything you did differently whilst writing Out of Easy than you did on Between Shades of Grey?
Yes. As I was writing Between Shades of Grey, I was doing the research at the same time. I thought that the best way to capture the story would be to write it as I was researching it, that it would have a sense of immediacy. And I found that really caused me a lot of problems because there was such an emotional intensity that the book was way too dark. And I had to go back and I had to rewrite it so many times. And the original Between Shades of Grey and what it became as the published novel is so drastically different. Whereas within Out of the Easy, I did the research and I got a sense of what I was, was going to put in the novel, and then I wrote it. And it was a much faster process. I didn't have to revise near as much. And the things I did, they were more historical and for Out of the Easy than emotional content that I had to revise.
Both of your books are historical fiction. Is there any chance of you straying away from that genre?
You know, I love historical so much. And someone asked me, you know, recently, they said, so, you know, is your books, they're a search for history? And although I write, you know, a search for history, it's also a search for story. And I think that history can be boring, but through characters, you know, and a certain storyline, suddenly these statistics, they become human. And suddenly we care for people we've never met. And suddenly history becomes important. We know the dates, we know the place on the map. And that's the power of books. And so as an author, I guess I feel that through historical fiction, I have an opportunity to give readers not only books they like, but books they need. You know, books to heal hearts and books to heal history. And also through historical fiction, I have a chance to reveal hidden heroes. You know, we tend to put people on a pedestal, you know, celebrities, musicians, the cult of personality. And in many cases, these people aren't heroes at all. And the hero is the quiet soul, you know, that was never a celebrity. And so if I can bring those everyday heroes, real heroes to light, that's something that I love doing. History holds secrets, and writing historical is a bit like being a detective. So for now, I'm sticking with it. I mean, I'm too old. I know better than to say always or never. You know, I know, but I love historical, and I'm so grateful that there are so many authors now, like, you know, Libba Bray, who's doing historical in a completely and unique way, or books like Codename Verity that you know are really pulling readers to historical fiction. So I'm certainly not alone, and there's a lot of people that are doing better, you know, doing it better than I am. So I'm still motivated.
Do you think you'll be sticking to the 20th century, or?
No. No, absolutely not. I think that's the thing about history. I mean, there are so many amazing stories. I have a list as long as my arm of things I'd like to write about. There are so many stories out there. I'm not, you know, short on material, just short on time.
So what's next?
So what's next? I'm going back to World War II. And I am writing a very little known story, but one that I'm really super excited about. And it takes place at the end of World War II when the Germans were fleeing from the Soviets. And it takes place in East Prussia. And as the Soviets were pushing in, the Germans staged this large naval evacuation called Operation Hannibal. And they commandeered every boat and every ship imaginable to get the Germans out of East Prussia. And they commandeered this ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff, and it was a cruise ship, and it hadn't sailed for, you know, several years. And they put the German soldiers aboard and then realized they had more room. The ship held about 1,500 people. So they decided to take some refugees, and there were refugees in the area from Lithuania, from Latvia, Estonia. There were ethnic Germans that were fleeing. There were East Prussians. There were some Polish people. There were so many people that wanted to get on the boat. Well, the boat held 1,500, but when it sailed, it had 10,000 people on it. And it had to sail in deep water because it had so much weight. And they sailed in the dead of night with all of the lights off because they didn't want to be seen by a Soviet plane. Well, a Soviet submarine found the boat and torpedoed this ship, and it sank within 45 minutes, and 9,000 people drowned. It's 9 times the size of the Titanic, and the world knows nothing of it because the Nazis hid the story. And people think, well, that was a German boat. The boat was full of refugees, full of innocent teenagers. Because imagine, the men were gone, and women and children, women could bring one child on the boat, but in many cases, they had more than one child, so they had to choose who to send. So they would send the teenagers. So this boat was full of teens, and all of these fates converged on board this ship. So the book follows 4 different teenagers, and they come together and board this ship. And it's not a cruise for leisure, it's a cruise for life. And I'm writing that right now, and talk about something intensely emotional. I was able to go to the area where the ship sank and meet with the divers, the original divers that dove the wreck. And they were told to go down because the Nazis were notorious for plundering art and valuables, and the ship was stuffed full of art and treasure. And these men were told to go down and retrieve that treasure, not knowing that there were 9,000 people and how that affected their lives and how it changed them. And so every step of the way, for this has just been so emotional. And some of the characters from Between Shades of Grey will resurface in this book.
So it's a sequel of sorts.
It's a continuation. It's a thread. There is a thread from Between Shades of Grey that continues in this new book, and I'm so enjoying writing it. And my family laughs and says, "Why do you do this to yourself?" Because I'll finish my day writing and I'll be a wreck. I'll be crying and in tears, but I'm passionate about it. There's so many people that were affected by this, and so few that survived, and the world knows nothing of it. So
I'm just going to jump back to Out of Easy because I missed the question. When we were emailing, I after having read Out of Easy, we spoke about Patrick. So this might be a spoilery question, but can you tell us more about him and how he came to sexuality and how that kind of developed? And I know his Kitty is based on a friend's mother of yours.
Well, when I was researching the time period of 1950 and the 1950s in general, I had this preconceived notion that it was this time of perfection and happiness, but it wasn't. It was really a time of secrecy and pain. And the more I researched, the more my heart was breaking for these people. Men had gone off to war, came back, and were dealing with the traumas of war, but it wasn't socially acceptable then to admit that you were full of pain or that you needed help. So they were suffering. Women had been recruited into the workforce during World War II with these images of Rosie the Riveter to serve their country, and they reluctantly went off to work and then realized, I enjoy this. But when the men came back, they had to surrender their jobs. So the women were disgruntled. So we had men who were disgruntled, we had women who were disgruntled. If someone were ill in your family, you weren't to talk about it. That was a black mark against the family if someone were sick. And this was all so painful to me. And as I was interviewing people, they were sharing secrets about themselves and the pain that they were in during this time, trying to keep up this facade. And one that I kept coming back to was this issue of sexuality and how, more than someone being sick or more than someone being depressed, this was something that was never spoken of, and that they themselves were trying, to change and hide, and felt they were born into this brokenness and some sort of deviance. And it was just heartbreaking for me. And so I thought of this character. We have, Josie Moraine on the one hand, who, feels that she's born into an identity that she can't change. And then I thought, well, Josie feels that everybody judges her, that her mother is a prostitute, and this is this, French Quarter of New Orleans, which is very small, and she feels it's so unfair that people judge her, and they misjudge her, and they think, that they know who she is, when in reality, she has misjudged her very best friend. And even she has blinders on because of the time period and the type of family that Patrick comes from. It's not even in her consciousness. So I thought of this character who has a best friend, and he's desperately trying to communicate to her. And she's missing it. And she's missing the point. And then women who were with men and married men not knowing that they were gay, because the men themselves weren't honest about they couldn't be honest about their sexual identity. And the pain that caused on so many fronts. And so I didn't want it to become the main focus of the novel, but it was something that broke my heart into so many pieces that I wanted to weave it in. And I did that through Patrick, who's suffering on many levels, with his father. His father is this writer, and then who is in early stages of Alzheimer's, which is undiagnosed. They simply think that he's, losing his mind. And so there's this complexity that Patrick is struggling with, not only telling his friends and being honest with his friends, but being honest with himself and who he is. And I am so happy and grateful that we have come so far. I know we still have a long way to go, but that we've come so far that these things, don't have to be a secret. And I sort of wanted to encompass that through a couple things in the story. The Siamese acorns. This is how these acorns came into the world, And some people could say, oh, that's some sort of mutation. They're beautiful, they're unique, they came into the world. And then, when Patrick is discovering his father's book, and they're trying to discover what the chapter name is, and he realizes it's called Be Love, and that his father was trying to send a message to his son saying, I know. And what's more important is the capacity to love another human being. It doesn't matter, if it's a woman loving a woman or a man loving a man. The important thing is to be able to love. And that's something Josie's struggling with herself. Her best friend has a capacity to love, but she doesn't understand the situation that he's going through. And that's my long-winded answer, but I hope you can tell that I was so passionate about this, and I'm so passionate about it when readers get it, and you got it, you were getting it right away, and maybe I made it a little bit too vague, but I didn't want it to take over the novel, but it was definitely a complexity of the time period that so many people I interviewed brought up. So I thought, well, to really be authentic, I'm going to put this in.
It's very heartbreaking, the novel. You had me almost in tears. Do you think you'll return to Patrick's story at some point?
I would love to. Because there's a...
Because at the end of the novel, he leaves, of course, and so you've got entire...
Here is someone that, Josie feels that she has to physically take herself out of New Orleans in order to have a chance at life. And her best friend feels that he has to do the same for different reasons. There are so many things that are similar to, in their stories, yet they can't verbalize this, and they can't, talk to one another about it. But they both physically feel that they have to leave New Orleans, and he goes off to the West Indies, where maybe he won't be under the watchful eye of these judgmental neighbors and people in uptown society. And she feels she has to go off to Northampton, where people don't know her, and the identity that she was born into. She can build a new one for herself. So yes, I would love to continue Patrick's story, and I have a million ideas about it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.